Welcome back to another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
All right, Ben, I'm going to toss it to you to tee up our segment. I should begin by noting this is a special Andrew Cuomo-focused show. We are talking only Cuomo today because there's so much to unpack on both the levels of how the media downplayed and ignored the scandal as it related to the nursing home deaths and also to his now evident issue with sexual harassment. So, Ben, I'm going to kick it off to you right now to tee up the first segment.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're not doing this show to further puff up Andrew Cuomo's ego, however wounded he is today. But this is a massive story, both in terms of the national politics, the local politics, and then as well, the chasm between the substance of what has transpired in what seems to be the downfall of King Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, versus how the media portrayed it in real time and some of the hypocrisy that we're seeing today, involving two major issues. The first being the sort of Potemkin pandemic effort in which New York had some of the worst outcomes of any major area in the world. Yet Andrew Cuomo was feted as this fearless leader, courageous, so competent and in command. And then also now, too, the sort of Me Too related downfall that we're seeing. And we have to talk a little bit about the interrelation between these, the politics dynamic, and then, of course, the media coverage of it and the chasm, again, between that coverage and the substance. So to deal with this topic, which is worthy of its own special episode, we have on as our guest today, Seth Barron, who's the managing editor of The American Mind, a publication of the Claremont Institute. And I'll note at the top, I'm a fellow at the Claremont Institute and I do some work with The American Mind as well. So we fully disclose here on Bad News. He also has a book coming out in May called The Last Days of New York, which seems to be quite an apt title. He's keenly attuned to New York politics. And so we thought he'd be the perfect person to have on the show. So Seth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Ben and Emily. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start at the top, which is Andrew Cuomo is now, it seems, being thrown under the bus with respect to his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Walk us through a little bit the rise and fall of the treatment of Andrew Cuomo and actually the substance of what was transpiring in New York in his handling of the pandemic that we're now seeing in real time unfold.
Sure thing. I mean, as early March, media figures across the spectrum were talking about how Andrew Cuomo's daily briefings were this masterful, calming presentation of facts. I mean, go and look at Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post. She had a tweet early March like, oh, he weaves science and math and facts and, just warmth and like his kind of good humor into this, just watch it. It's amazing. And then it went on from there. In terms of what was actually happening, let me just run through quickly. In late March, his health commissioner, Howard Zucker, issued a order that required nursing homes and long-term care facilities to admit or readmit hospital discharged COVID patients, regardless of whether they were still infectious or not. This was done at a time when the whole principle was that we needed to flatten the curve and save the hospitals. The idea being that hospitals were shortly going to be overrun by gasping patients. Now, this turns out to have been not a good idea. Cuomo defends it by saying, well, we said that nursing homes should only take patients if they had the ability to, quarantine them and in sterile environments. But nursing homes aren't set up that way. They're not like level 4 biohazard containment facilities. They barely even had enough masks or hand sanitizer. But at the same time, it was a mistake. But I personally think that it was kind of a justifiable mistake in a way. To me, the idea that Cuomo is responsible for murdering people is as absurd as saying that Trump was responsible for murdering everyone who died from the pandemic. All right, that being said, he did allow this policy to go on really long until May. which was longer than most states. He did not indemnify, but give immunity to any nursing home operators, like from any legal prosecution or what do you call it, being sued. So, that was questionable. All in all, it turned out to be a bad policy. However, he never admitted it was a bad policy, and the media, the national media, just puffed him up to, he's already a notoriously egotistical, vainglorious, like megalomaniac. And they just went bonkers with it. A lot of this was basically to set him up as a foil to Trump. The idea was that Trump was this anti-leader. He was just telling everybody to intravenously take bleach, to just gobble hydroxychloroquine, and not to worry about anything. This wasn't a real issue. Whereas Cuomo was following the science and calmly and patiently telling everyone what to do and leavening it with this kind of bocce court wit and warmth. So it just went nuts. Everybody's seen the most egregious examples of people stoking the flames of his ego. From Mark Ruffalo to Ellen DeGeneres to, politicians across the spectrum. The New York Times published a piece saying he's the, what did they say? He's the bully. Can't remember exactly what it was. It was essentially like, he's the bully we need now. This is somebody we need to have him in charge. People talked about him as possibly like that maybe they would draft him to be president.
Do you think that's what he wanted? Do you think the reason that Andrew Cuomo came out, wrote a book, and was clearly basking in the media attention he was getting is because he did have imminent hopes of perhaps running in 2024?
Oh, yes, certainly. If not, this 2020. This has always been a thing with Cuomo and his father, this idea that, will he or won't he? This goes back to the 80s. I think he probably, his ambitions are boundless. So sure.
Now, I want to actually touch on a tension that you've brought up a couple of times, which is that he's sort of notoriously vainglorious and prickly, and it's kind of, it's sort of the New York thing that goes over really, maybe New York values, as Senator Cruz would say.
Okay.
But so he sort of has that element to his personality that's really crucial to who he is. But at the same time, the media had their foot off the gas, for like at least 6 months. Why do you think that is? You just explained that it was to create this foil to Trump, but it's still so interesting to me that someone who is as I would say like unlikable from my perspective as Andrew Cuomo got so much. It's not even that the coverage was fawning, because yes, it was. There was friendly and fawning coverage, but it's also that there was just a total dearth of coverage. There was a dearth of investigations into some of the serious stuff that you've highlighted in your articles. And just now, this stuff was happening and the media was not looking into it. So what do you think explained that? It seems like attention to me, but maybe it's not.
Well, I think that the way a lot of media coverage happened under Trump was that it was Manichaean. Everything that happened was his fault. There was no sense of shared blame. There was no sense that anything that happened could be explained as just a complication, as a difficult situation, as a bipartisan failing. Everything that happened regarding coronavirus in particular was the fault of Donald Trump from the very beginning. So, that being the case, they just split it in two and gave Cuomo all the credit. Since Trump is gone now, in fact, if not in spirit, he, the shine is off, and truth kind of leaks out a little bit.
Something that I think we find with a lot of these stories is it's very clear that the media portrayal of what is transpiring and then the actual substance of it there's this great chasm, as I mentioned, and a muckraking journalist, even someone who just scratches the surface, could probably make a career, at least on the substance, of breaking major stories about this. So one of the things I wanted to ask, Seth, is there wasn't a lot of media coverage, first of all, of the dramatic cuts that New York had made in the years leading up to this to certain hospital systems that created the potential, the looming crisis that ultimately pushed the governor's underlings to push this policy with nursing homes. And then there was at the same time this massive cover-up that we now know about that really I think might have first been broken by a writer at the Albany Times-Union, so not a huge newspaper nationally, certainly. Why was it that the media, beyond the fact that they obviously wanted to create this foil, as you noted, to make Trump look bad and the Democrat look like brilliant here, why wasn't anyone trying to break these stories about how did we get to this place in the first place of a potential crisis? And then is there a serious cover up here?
The New York media is, New York has a reputation as being this like fearless, tough town. But the New York media, I would certainly exempt certain, particular journalists from this designation, is fairly quiescent and doesn't really investigate things very seriously. And tends not to attack, look, with Bill de Blasio, yes, there's been criticism of Bill de Blasio, but regarding the structure of Democratic politics in New York State, which is basically total in terms of its grip on power, there's just not a lot of insight into what's going on. I think most journalists tend to accept the progressive Democratic line, which is that, we have this great state system. Probably the only problem is that we don't have high enough taxes. So it's more complex than that. But the idea that New York media is filled with, hard-bitten, hard-driven investigative reporters just doesn't really live up to reality.
Yeah, that's a really good question because the New York media is it's such an important element of all of this, but the national media too. When we look back and think about what was happening on a nightly basis in CNN with Chris Cuomo, obviously Andrew Cuomo's brother, it's an incredible embarrassment for CNN, but it's one that they seem not to have any interest in dealing with. We heard Chris Cuomo say that he couldn't cover the sexual harassment and the sexual misconduct allegations because Andrew Cuomo is his brother. When he was happy to cover the coronavirus, his brother's handling of the coronavirus. Why do you think the media let them get away with that shtick for, I think it was more than a month? That was a really ongoing thing for a long time. Why do you think that the media itself, CNN, the network of apples and bananas, fact versus fiction, why do you think that's something that was allowed to stand?
I would say that in some, especially over the last 4 years, it's always been this way to some extent, but really now, the entire media establishment, especially CNN, essentially serves as the Democratic Party's communications arm nationally. They're the DNC's spokespeople. I don't see, I think it's foolish to even pretend that there's much of a difference. We just see this all the time in terms of messaging, the coordination of campaign type statements. So there's not any difference. Maybe that's just an extraordinarily cynical way to look at it, but I think that CNN that's what they see themselves as doing, like just, supporting the Democratic Party and pushing whatever the narrative is. Is it that simple? Maybe I'm misreading it, but to me, it just seems like, oh, great. Well, Chris Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, let's get this show on the road. They don't see it as a problem.
So one question that's come up, and I have a couple of theories about this, but I'd be interested to hear yours, especially as someone who's keenly attuned to the inside baseball of New York politics, and then also how the media covers it is now it appears it's open season on Andrew Cuomo. The dam has broken, and all of a sudden there are all these exposés, really, I think, led, starting with Attorney General Letitia James coming out with a report showing how much the Cuomo administration undercounted and deceived on the death numbers. Why do you believe it's open season on Andrew Cuomo now, beyond the fact that President Trump is out of office?
Oh, I don't think it's open season on Andrew Cuomo. I would push back on that entire supposition. The Empire Center, which is a right-wing think tank in Albany, sued to have the real data on nursing home deaths released. And after they, won, that's when Tish James put out her report, which came out on a Friday. And if you read it, it was actually pretty tepid in its criticism. It just said, yeah, this is what happened. That's what happened. Letitia James is a creature of Andrew Cuomo. That's why she's Attorney General, essentially, because of his support. I don't think she's really come out against him. And if you look at regarding his current scandal with the sex abuse allegation, not even abuse, the sexual harassment allegations, the national media has been silent on it. The New York Post has been vigorous. The Daily News has been quiet. The Times has covered it, I guess. People have asked him about it, but here's how he's gotten out of it. They've said, okay, what we need to do is have an independent investigation. We can't let Cuomo run the investigation. So they've said, we need Tish James to run the investigation. So she's appointing someone to look into it. So it's going to take, who knows, 6, 8 weeks, 12 weeks to run through this. By that time, the whole thing will have died down. She's an ally. The governor of New York is extraordinarily powerful. He basically controls the entire budget. We're coming into, budget season is ongoing. Any legislator who comes out against him can get screwed. We have not seen any of his allies turn on him in government. If you maybe Alyssa Milano or Me Too associated actresses have turned on him. But, sure, Bill de Blasio has been, railing against him, and other leftists in the Democrat Party have been, but they always do. So far, nobody has gone against him. So the idea that he's been thrown under the bus about this, I would say not. I have a little theory. If I were on Andrew Cuomo's communications team a couple weeks ago, at the height of the nursing home scandal, I would have said, hey, why don't we leak a few mild sex harassment allegations to distract everybody from the nursing home scandal? And that'll just eat up all the oxygen until we can get out of all of this. I don't think that's what happened necessarily, but it's a lot easier to get around, he hugged somebody, he tried to kiss someone at a wedding. I think these are egregious. I don't think he's innocent, but at the same time, polls coming out show he's still massively popular across New York State. He has a $40 million war chest for next year. He could easily be renominated and win a fourth term.
That's really interesting. I think, before we let Seth go, you just touched on this overlap between the sexual harassment news and allegations and the intensification of the nursing home scrutiny. To what extent are those connected? To what extent is this timing interesting? Where do you think the timing plays into how this is unraveling literally right now as leaks continue and allegations continue?
Well, I don't know. Lindsey Boylan, who's running for Manhattan Borough President, she's a former Cuomo aide. She was the first one to reveal that he made some comments to her and made her feel, I think he tried to kiss her, perhaps, she says. he denies it. She's in the middle of a tight campaign. So she may have seen it as a way to get attention. I don't know, but it's certainly curious. I mean, a lot of the time, scandals happen and then things open up and people are willing to pay attention to things and people feel comfortable jumping in with allegations. But I'll tell you something, the way in which, like, the Post has sort of scraped around trying to find more and more evidence, I'm not so sure that it's making their case. I mean, like, while he was getting a nasal swab, he told a nurse or a doctor, "Oh, you make that gown look great. You look, something like that." Look, politicians, there's no, it's what politicians do on a day-to-day basis is largely indistinguishable from flirting. They just flirt with everyone, men, women, whoever. It's just constant glad-handing, complimenting, and it's all like, fulsome and meaningless, and everybody knows that. I don't think he was coming on to that nurse or doctor, and I don't think she felt he was. Politicians hug and kiss people all the time, so it's going to make it seem like, oh, this is just a bunch of bull. If they just keep bringing up things like he tried to kiss someone at a wedding in public, people are going to just shrug it off. So I think I lost the thread of what your question was, but the two things, I don't know if they're actually related, but once there's a little crack in the dam, then the flood, it creates like a flood. I just don't think it's necessarily going to even affect him ultimately.
Mm.
So at the end of the day, you think he survives this. There's a feeding frenzy of sorts for a little bit, but ultimately this is just sort of some people are going to extract their ounce of flesh and it'll just pass, and he'll fight it to the death, I'm sure.
I mean, look at Governor Northam in Virginia. I mean, he's a much less powerful figure, and he got through. And there's pictures of him wearing like blackface, like holding a noose or something, just in a Klan out. I mean, just the craziest, most egregious thing. And he was just like, and he got by. So why wouldn't Cuomo get by?
Right.
I don't see it. I just see him like getting through this and possibly cruising to re-election next year.
So the takeaway is essentially your intentions and how you present yourself superficially ultimately is what matters more than the substance, to the extent you have a sycophantic media that will portray you in the greatest light during a crisis. Well,
that works if you like basically have singular control of a $200 billion state budget. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Seth, thank you so much for your time this morning. Thank you for joining us on Bad News to lend your insights into this crazy year as it is related to the governor of New York. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Take care.
All right, Ben, I actually want to roll some tape because there's so much good tape. I'm like excited. I'm very excited to roll this tape. This is courtesy of Grabien, and Grabien has amazing supercuts all the time, but this is courtesy of Tom Elliott and Grabien.
We're grateful that across the country there are responsible leaders who are stepping up. One of them provided clear direction and memorable PowerPoints. New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo.
I heard, though, that you had a crush on our boyfriend, Andrew Cuomo.
Dude, everyone does, right? I think he's fantastic.
You know Cuomo. He even had a 70% approval rating in April with Republicans. Why? Because he was leading.
Even lifelong Republicans tell me, they look at Cuomo and they're like, God, there's a leader.
Governor Cuomo, who has been a leader in calling for science-based ways to fight this coronavirus. The Academy says that he's being recognized for, quote, his leadership during the COVID pandemic.
Okay, so notice on that last clip, the date was April. So by that point, we had already known that there was mismanagement that needed to be probed. Am I wrong? Oh, Ben, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm just so angry over here. No, first of all, he sort of deflected when he was first asked about who made the call with respect to nursing homes. And then over time, he sort of cracked, and then he kind of shrugged it off. And then ultimately, only after it was overwhelmingly clear and the terrible damage to over 10,000 families, 10,000 individuals, and then their family members and friends had to deal with the heartbreak of those decisions, did he ever relent on it? But then they lied about the numbers too. And it also seems, it's worth noting, that it appears they obstructed justice potentially when the DOJ was probing into deaths and nursing home policies relating to them. So that's a major scandal. And the media just completely let it go when it was abundantly clear. Okay, we know that this disease acutely impacts those who are older, those who have certain underlying conditions. It was abundantly clear to everyone. And yet they pursued this policy literally to the death.
Look at this outrageous tweet that's on the screen here right now. This is from BuzzFeed, a purported news organization. In the middle of a crisis when the governor of New York is responsible for overseeing the health and safety of millions of people in a pandemic, they're saying, take this poll and settle the debate. Who's the hottest Cuomo brother? Andrew Cuomo and Chris Cuomo can't stop cracking jokes about each other on live TV, and it's glorious. Now, BuzzFeed does serious reporting, or attempts to do serious reporting on national security, on immigration, on a variety of very serious issues. And if I was one of the reporters that was tasked with doing any of that work, I would be absolutely furious about this, because the notion that anybody who works in the news media, whether they're at BuzzFeed or Vogue or the Washington Post or the New York Times, the fact that they would have the mentality to run something about who's the hottest Cuomo brother when one of the Cuomo brothers is overseeing the health and safety of millions of people in the pandemic, where they would just call it their routine glorious. It's stunning. I mean, it's not that surprising to me, but it's absolutely stunning to think about the fact that this is a news organization. Well, the governor's overseeing, a pandemic response. They should know to be skeptical. They should know that something could be happening behind the scenes. And I remember I wrote an article at the time when they were doing their routine, and I was saying, listen, everything on the surface might seem to be fine now, but months later, you could find out that because you were fawning over Andrew Cuomo and because he was being boosted, like this, his shtick with Chris Cuomo distracted people from the severity or from the substance of what he was doing as governor, because it just was a massive PR boost. It didn't just get positive coverage on CNN. It then got these articles in BuzzFeed and Vogue that we just scrolled through. It got that love letter from Chelsea Handler. That CNN shtick was at the heart of so much of the PR boost that Andrew Cuomo got throughout all of this thing. And I said at the time, we could find out months later that there was serious stuff happening while this is going on. And that is exactly what happened. And it just is, again, stunning to me that journalists don't have the mentality that, like, we need to be skeptical of every politician, especially these two Cuomo guys, like joking it up during a pandemic, because there's serious stuff happening. It boggles the mind.
And you know what's amazing? We've only touched like a fraction of the entire magnitude of all of this, because at the same time that the media was doing more than putting lipstick on a pig. I mean, it's embarrassing and discrediting what they were doing. And to your point about Chris Cuomo before, the fact that now we can't talk when the terrible revelations came up, but then he can hug and kiss his brother on television and welcome him as the savior just is beyond discrediting. I mean, it would wreck mere mortals' careers, but it'll probably be a blip when you look back at Chris Cuomo's career. But this doesn't even touch on the fact, something the media, of course, would never talk about with a Democrat, but, had President Trump taken anti-federalist positions during this and tried to usurp total power in the federal government, he would have been savaged to the death. If Joe Biden were to do the same thing, he'd be cheered for being in command. But the more micro example, relatively, of Andrew Cuomo, he essentially had executive orders in place that gave him total power over the state to declare emergencies and do what he wished with any part of the state he wished. And there were lawsuits raised against it and attempts to file injunctions and the like. That in and of itself, the fact that governors usurped the power of the legislative branch and had total power and were kings, that should be a scandal. That's something that should actually be drilled down on. But I'd say because of the bias, of course, of the media towards strongman figures, even though they say, the conservatives or the authoritarians, you heard nothing about it. But how many innocent lives were destroyed not just those who were touched by the deaths of those sent to nursing homes to face their deaths and could not be mourned by their families, but of course then all of the businesses that were destroyed, all of the people who had to stay home and educate their kids or keep their kids occupied, and inability to work during that time. And of course, the privileged elites paid the least price for it. And in many cases, some of their companies benefited. But for the average New Yorker, this was a disaster for them. And it was self-imposed. And in real time, I mean, I probably tweeted this out 15 different ways. Are we cutting off our nose to spite our face by ceding total power to essentially a tyrant, in this case, in Governor Cuomo, and committing essentially self-imposed suicide all around? Now, obviously, the argument was public health. However, like we said, it was very clear pretty early on who this acutely impacted and what a rational policy would be, which is protect those who are at most risk and let others essentially resume some form of normalcy. And we can debate that, obviously, but a press never even asked those questions. It was just accepted. We have to have total lockdowns. It makes total sense, even though the science was never settled during this and continues not to be settled. As you see Dr. Fauci going back and forth about what we should do with the schools, and now we should wear double masks when originally we shouldn't wear any. It's a total indictment of the political class and the media that was the mouthpieces for them this entire time. And the last quick point I'll make in this rant is just part of the reason I'd say two quick reasons that I believe that now it's all unraveling for Cuomo to an extent, and he may well survive. But part of the reason is because, first of all, he's taking fire and it covers for the other governors who implemented similar policies to the same disastrous effect and never really paid a price for it, namely the Pennsylvania governor, Michigan governor, New Jersey governor, and beyond. And then number two, if he had aspirations of being president, this is a way to prevent him potentially from ever being able to run for it. Now, he still might. If there's a lesson from Bill Clinton, it's you never give up, you never stop fighting. And I'm sure, given Cuomo's ego, he's right there with Bill Clinton, maybe in more ways than one. But this is probably in part about derailing his ambitions higher than New York governor.
Well, listen, I think the sexual harassment stuff that's coming out right now is a great, it's just a great example of why that BuzzFeed coverage and that Vogue coverage is absurd to begin with. And it's because, again, politicians as a rule suck. They are corrupt. They, more often than not, they are great, as Seth was talking about, at the glad handing and at the sort of professional flirtation that is natural to the job. But behind the scenes, 9 times out of 10, they're corrupt. And that's why the media exists, the fourth estate, to hold the powerful people to account. And calling the shtick on CNN glorious, which Cuomo brother is hotter, aggregating Chelsea Handler's love letter to Andrew Cuomo, and even MSNBC, we showed on the screen some of their just more favorable, warmer coverage of what he was doing. That was always a bad idea. Even if he had been handling, let's say hypothetically, he had handled the pandemic flawlessly and he had had no problems. Let's say that it actually happened. It's still not appropriate to be running these headlines because you never know what is actually happening until it's investigated. He's in charge of people. He's in a position of power. To just sort of boost him up with exactly the kind of press coverage that he would want is outrageous. There's no reason to ever do that if you're the media. And some people may be tempted to say that it's sort of the entertainment-ification of the news media when you look at BuzzFeed or whatever. I actually have no problem with that. I have no problem with Jimmy Fallon, ruffling Trump's hair or saying he's enjoying Andrew Cuomo, because we have different expectations for people like that. But again, if you are going to be a serious news organization that does serious investigations and wants to be treated seriously, you cannot treat politicians that way. It is not how journalists conduct themselves. And the consequence of it is that people like Andrew Cuomo get a pass for months and people die. I mean, the bad decisions are made that lead to bad consequences for people when you just take your foot off the gas because you're enjoying the person's affable personality. There are actual consequences to the media's nonsense. And that is what we see with Andrew Cuomo. It's almost the perfect example. And if it is true that in all of this time, he was sexually harassing women beyond, what Seth was talking about, the nurse comment, some of the allegations are certainly more serious than that. So If he was mistreating women during all of this, the media's coverage allowed him to do that. The media's coverage enabled it because they weren't probing deeply into what was actually happening in the administration. They weren't asking serious questions. They had him feeling like he was on top of the freaking world. And that's where all of this, like, that's what the consequences are. And they're serious and they're beyond just like tweets. There are real world consequences to media malfeasance.
Let's talk about one other consequence, which is, maybe the most egregious example thus far is Dahlia Lithwick, who covers these sorts of matters for Slate. And of course, like the entire media, corporate media and its adjuncts, rushed to brand Judge Kavanaugh the worst of human beings, gang rapist and the like, when there was not a scintilla of evidence to support it, and he was guilty before proven innocent, and in the minds of many, he will be forever guilty, although his real guilt is probably that he was nominated by President Trump. I mean, that's probably the real crime that he was guilty of. Now, Dahlia Lithwick is saying, well, maybe we should give due process to Governor Cuomo, and let's let the facts roll in and presume him innocent before guilty. Do you think that we're going to see the entire media take that exact same tact? And what are the consequences if the media says due process for me, but not for thee?
I mean, I actually think they're trying to prove a point because they have suddenly sort of realized how bad their Cuomo coverage was. And I think that's why we see some of the thirst to jump on top of these Cuomo stories now.
And delete tweets.
Right, and delete tweets like Ben Smith did, and we put that on the screen earlier. And so, yeah, I think they're like, part of what we're seeing with the sexual harassment coverage is that they're trying to prove that they're serious because they realized that they acted unseriously earlier this year, and they realized that they were too friendly. Look at this from Trevor Noah. He slams people who praised Cuomo last year after calling himself a Cuomo-sexual. I mean, it's like now that it's a sort of like leftist pet issue, like sexual harassment and the Me Too movement, they are ready to like take on Andrew Cuomo. It's like, it is just infuriating.
Yeah. I think to your point, though, there's sort of a cover-up effort here going on among all parties involved. But I think they all assume that they're going to skate at the end of the day because no one ever pays a price. And maybe that's the thing that's most infuriating, and it sort of binds the media and the political class, is that the bad actors who are in good standing in our ruling class never seem to pay, but all the innocents who get run over in their quest for power are left victims, and they never get any justice for what happens. And that might explain more than anything else the anger that exists in the country today and the demoralization over the fact that it's one set of rules for one class and one set of rules for everyone else.
100%. That is so true. And that's an indirect consequence of all of this, but it's a consequence of all of this. And the media, who claim to be the firefighters of our politics, they have no idea what they're actually doing to the country. They really don't know. And if they did know, I'm not sure that they would really care, but they just have no idea. Ben, I know we wanted to talk about some things that happened in the White House briefing room this week before we, just as a sort of like palate cleanser from the Cuomo scandals. Here's one tweet that we pulled here. This is White House press briefings are really just staff meetings at this point, after a reporter wondered, why doesn't the president consider ratcheting up his rhetoric beyond Neanderthal? Why doesn't he think about saying, if you don't wear your mask, people are going to die because of you? And then Jen Psaki responds, well, noted. It's like the comms team has gathered for a strategy session.
It really is a comms. And Neanderthal thinking. Joe Biden, of all people to accuse others of Neanderthal thinking, I think really speaks for itself about where we are in this country, where our media class is as well. And we needed to have a corrective to the good news that we showed earlier this week of Matt Lee challenging State Department spokesman Ned Price. And by the way, that challenging continues. I urge everyone, you probably never thought you want to go out and read the transcript of State Department press briefings. But actually, there are some good probing questions getting asked every day. Not from a conservative perspective, by the way. In many cases, you might disagree with the intent behind the questions or what they imply. But nevertheless, there is actual holding people in power to account that's going on in at least one area, but clearly not for the White House press spokesperson, Jen Psaki. And it's an embarrassment to the country. And of course, the contrast between the coverage of Trump and the coverage of Biden is just beyond the pale.
So we had on Wednesday's show, we talked about Marty Baron, the outgoing executive editor of the Washington Post, saying that the Washington Post is not an organ of the Democratic Party. And I think Ben and I both agreed, it's not about the Democratic Party. It's about the sort of broader left. No, you're not an organ of the Democratic Party. You're an organ of the broader left. But again, what's downstream of that is a heck of a lot of positive and friendly and favorable coverage of the Democrats. So check out this headline that Ben pulled for us. House Democrats pass sweeping elections bill as GOP legislators push to restrict voting. This is very similar to a chyron that I saw on MSNBC on Wednesday that said far right focuses on cancel culture as Democrats work on COVID relief bill. And so the framing here is very purposefully to say Democrats are serious. Republicans are a bunch of toothless rubes that are foaming at the mouth over these unserious issues. What did you think about the headline in contrast with Barron's comments earlier?
I mean, first of all, we might have to do an episode on HR1, which is the bill that they're referring to here, of how it's covered versus what the actual substance of the bill is, because the substance of the bill essentially, and I'll be general here and we can drill into the specifics maybe in another episode, is make all of the extraordinary measures that created all of these questions around 2020 federal law and take the power to run elections out of the hands of the states. That's what HR1 does. In effect, what I think it does is it enshrines Democrat power in perpetuity. That's my biased reading of it, but I also think that's where the substance ultimately goes. Juxtapose that with the headline, of course, which is, Republicans want to take away voting rights, and they will, and essentially this is all the narrative of they want to go back to the Jim Crow South. They want to suppress the vote, et cetera. When, of course, one can easily make the argument, no, we want there to be integrity in the vote, and we don't want illegal votes to dilute the votes of legal voters. Neither here nor there. Marty Baron, how do you respond to that? You cannot say that your media enterprise is not an organ of at least left-wing ideology when you run columns like that as straight news. I mean, almost every day now I've taken to tweeting out screen grabs of the Washington Post opinion page, because it is so far beyond the Babylon Bee, the headlines, and they're so sanctimonious. And I really think they actually have drank the Kool-Aid and they believe what they actually put out there. And we kind of talked about that, Marty Baron as well. But it's just, the opinion page is laughable and no one can take it seriously. But this is the straight news part of the Washington Post. So it's just another embarrassment. But again, they never pay a price for it. And maybe they don't have to, because they're catering to an ever smaller but increasingly powerful portion of the country. And that's all that matters. And that can sustain them. And Jeff Bezos has pretty big pockets too. But it's embarrassing to witness. If you have any self-respect, how do you run a headline like that under straight news?
Yeah, well, it's because they are so far gone from a position to be able to arbitrate neutrality, as we talked about. And the good news of that is if we can get to a point where we sort of cross the threshold and they can just label themselves as a left-wing paper, then fine, right? They have a ton of resources and people will know what they're getting, and won't see won't continue to be grossly misled into thinking that this is the neutral depiction of what's happening in Washington, D.C. But as it stands, the Washington Post and Marty Baron are doing an incredible disservice to the public, and are dividing the country and hurting the country immensely with every single story that goes out like this. So with that, Ben, this has been a mammoth edition of Bad News, but there was so much to cover with Andrew Cuomo. We hope that it was helpful, and we appreciate everybody for sticking with us.
Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a great Friday.
Yeah, have a
Bad News extravaganza.
Yes. Now that you've had all of the bad news, you can try to have a happy weekend, I guess. But you've been watching another edition of Bad News. It's a production of The Federalist and sponsored by the National Journalism Center. We will be back next Wednesday and next Friday with more. So please subscribe and please stay tuned. Until then, have a great